Rick Owens is the most unlikely success story in fashion. How a young American from rural California would go from working at Taco Bell to owning a $100 million company selling the world his idea of gothic avant-garde luxury. The brand feels like it should be limited to niche Berlin art scenes, but instead is favored by professional athletes, tech CEOs, and the average teen from Ohio. Rick's originality and captivating design has led for his name to be the most famous American independent designer of the 21st century, with influence leading to collaborations with the likes of Converse, Birkenstock, Doc Martens, Adidas, Moncler, Champion, Aesop, Rimowa, and Eastpak, and a legacy that has accolades from the White House. Rick Owens has created a design philosophy and language that goes well beyond clothes and accessories, to furniture and architecture, to toothpaste and burgers. Welcome to a comprehensive guide on the world of Rick Owens. What's good, everybody? My name is Karsten Kraning. If you don't know me, I'm a clothing designer, and in my spare time, I make YouTube videos like this. Welcome to the third video in my comprehensive guide to the work of Rick Owens. This is an ongoing series where I'm diving in and giving an analysis of every single season of Rick Owens' work across 25 years. So far, we've covered his early years in Hollywood to his rise to fame in Paris. The first era, he was known for delivering something called glunge, sort of this mix of Hollywood glamour and grunge. And then in that second era of his work, once he arrived to Paris, he started creating something which I would call post-apocalyptic. These futuristic, somewhat cult-like uniforms that would help him build a fashion empire and a cult following. This next era of Rick's work I like to call post-human. Rick has created such a big fashion empire at this point through diffusion lines, sneaker sales, multiple of his own retail locations all across North America, Europe, and Asia, that the runway for him can become a pure means of expression. He doesn't have to worry about putting best-selling styles down the runway season after season anymore, as he's established himself and his business at this point. So the runway can be a pure means of artistic expression for him, which is going to make this era unique. But this artistic expression that Rick is putting down the runway is not all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, this era of Rick's work is probably where he went through the most personal turmoil. Rick is dealing with these really big existential questions around climate change and what that really means for humanity, as well as his personal life would go through a myriad of different losses and challenges. Rick's father would pass away during this era, and while Rick had a very complicated relationship with his father, they didn't even really speak in his final years alive. This does account for a tonal shift during this period, where Rick's work becomes more aware of darkness and Rick's work becomes more acute to the darkness in the world and how fragile life really is. You also see Rick's relationship with the body becoming much more abstract, and of course this is influenced by Gilles Deleuze, but it's also related to some relationship issues he was having with his wife, Michelle Lamy. And so you see all of this turmoil that Rick is going through in this period manifesting itself onto the runway. And it's where we see Rick Owens wrestling with these dark, complicated emotions, but also at the end of the day, finding hope. I'm excited to talk about this with you guys and dive in, but before we get too deep into it, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Gamma. Listen, I work in the creative industry and with creatives all the time, and because of that, I'm always presenting, making, or looking at other people's pitch decks. They're really useful for whether you're trying to introduce a new product, create a commercial, etc., etc. But the one thing is that presentation templates can often get overused. They can get repetitive and boring, especially if everyone's using the same ones. And when you're really trying to win over a client or your team's imagination and inspiration, having a creative, unique pitch deck is important. And that's where Gamma can come in. Gamma makes it effortless to create beautiful, professional presentations. You can use their highly unique templates that they have, or generate your own using their AI tools to create something entirely unique to you and the vibe you're trying to give off. That you can either put in your own creative assets into, or even just put in a prompt. For example, let's say you're me, I'm trying to make a brief for a fragrance that I just created for my brand, for some creatives that I'm working with for a commercial. What I'm gonna do is I just put in the prompt to explain the vibe, and it generates a unique presentation exactly to my specifications. When I first used Gamma, I didn't expect it to be able to build out as much as it does and really capture the exact vibe that I was looking for. I can also, of course, go customize the presentation with my own text and images as well. And it really just creates a presentation that is not only clean, aesthetically pleasing, and professional, but it has these unique touches and a flow to it that I think really inspires people and helps win them over for what you're trying to do. Definitely go check out Gamma if you're looking for a tool to make your presentations look amazing, professional. I created this presentation in just under 20 minutes. Check out the link in my bio or scan the QR code on the screen. And I would really like to thank Gamma personally for sponsoring today's video. Doing this type of in-depth fashion analysis and a series like this takes a lot of time, and I really wouldn't be able to do it without sponsors like these. As all of this information is free, I don't require people to pay. And let's get into it with the first season of Rick Owens. Rick Owens' first new collection in this new era of Rick is called Spring-Summer 2015 Faun. I call this era the post-human era because the last era was sort of focused on creating what felt like post-apocalyptic, epic, operatic, almost Wagnerian style of cult uniforms. But this next era of Rick is going to become a lot more avant-garde in the clothes themselves, to the point where the wearer doesn't feel as relevant. Runway is going to become predominantly about expression rather than focused on actually showing the products that Rick Owens wants his buyers and consumers to wear. It's gonna become about showing art. In other words, the clothes that Rick Owens shows in this era are going to be unwearable, for lack of a better word. There's going to be these avant-garde distortions that portray something of the severity of the human condition. A lot of the themes here are also going to become a lot more severe and serious. While the climate crisis has always been sort of an ever-present theme in the background of Rick's work since Dustulator, it becomes a lot more serious here, as well as some pretty dark themes surrounding human depravity, greed, and the animalistic qualities that humans can take on. And it shouldn't be a shock that a lot of these collections in this era are named after either mythical creatures or monsters that embody some of the worst evils of human, or mythical locations that also embody the worst qualities of human. Which is why I call this era post-human, as the clothes are morphing into these almost anti-human forms and silhouettes, and the themes, instead of being about virtues, are a lot more about clear depravity. And it's kind of playing with this theme about a world where humanity may die out. It's so much more serious in tone, it's so much more abstract and avant-garde, and Rick is taking a lot of cues with his design philosophy from Ray Kawakubo and Marcel Breuer, in the way that both of those artists have work that's less about flowing with the natural elements and forms of humans and more about creating an expression where the subject is independent from the object of creation, which is where we enter with this Faun collection. Now, the runway itself, Faun, is named after a ballet. The ballet, specifically La Prise Midi d'une Faun. I'm sorry about my terrible French pronunciation, but this translates roughly into the afternoon of the Faun, which was a scandalous debut ballet, which kind of sets a similar tone to Rick introducing this new post-human era. The play is about a faun who dances with these nymphs, another mythical creature, and is overcome by this sort of desire and tries to chase one. As the fauns run away, one of them drops their scarf and he loses her. The faun then stimulates himself, shall we say, with the scarf in an end of Evangelion hospital scene moment. And that's what the whole ballet is about. It's really sort of disturbing, strange subject matter here. And when it was released in the early 1900s in Russia, I believe, it was majorly controversial. But there's a reason Rick is focused on this in the post-human era, about the extent of depravity in humanity. This is a play about how desire, when unchecked, leads to destruction. And for Rick, this collection is a reflection of that. Unchecked desire leads to these sort of carnal displays of depravity, and so our desires must be met with discipline. This is something that's a huge deal for Rick, and he's really playing with these themes to show us this ugly side of what can happen if we don't really live with discipline. When Nijinsky, the creator of the play, made this work, he was very vaguely inspired by the Cubist art scene, which was around disrupting paintings through these geometrical distortions of the subject. And Nijinsky similarly wanted to disrupt ballet in the same way that Cubism did for painting. Now, Nijinsky did this by choosing insane subject matter to make a ballet about, but Rick also reinterprets Cubism, interestingly enough. And you see all these sort of Cubist geometrical design language throughout the collection. The models wear these sort of monoliths or dresses that are either use sheer or straps to create geometrical patterns and wrap the subject in the same way that Cubism does. And the color palette is also a direct reference to the Leon box posters that were used for the original ballet. There's a story or a rumor that interior designer Jean-Michel Frank, one of Rick's personal heroes, was also in the audience of that play. This is unverified. Rick seems to believe it, but he also referenced the overcoats of Jean-Michel Frank because of it. All of these elements are basically just putting together the influences and the themes of this ballet into one collection. And there's an interesting parallel with this collection to Rick's personal life in two ways. One is the figure of the Faun and sort of unchecked discipline kind of is reminiscent of Rick himself, as when he was young, he definitely had a lot of problems with substance abuse, which led him to sort of have a wild 20s and 30s. And so he himself has had to become disciplined. The other is that while Rick was making this collection, he was also helping a model who was struggling with alcoholism. And Rick let him stay at his house, and Michel Lamy supported him through his recovery. His drawings actually appear as embroidery on the pieces. Whether the desire is lust, substance abuse, whatever it might be, Rick wants to sort of work this into a story of redemption. The next collection is Sphinx, Autumn-Winter 2015. You'll notice here Rick is keeping in this naming convention of naming collections after these inhuman, chimeric, mythical creatures. The Sphinx also sort of builds on the concept of depravity, though in a more tongue-in-cheek way. In a sort of flipping of sexual power dynamics, that is actually an indication of the name. While the Faun in mythology is sort of this pathetic, powerless, character in sexual dynamics whose desires are unchecked and they sort of fall victim to their own desires. In mythology, the Sphinx is this chimeric, beautiful woman, this lioness or lion with wings that has the power to seduce you, but also to kill you, and to be cunning and smart and to use its charms and wisdom to trap men. Rick is reflecting on how depravity and lust can also be used as a mechanism for power and to take advantage of others. Genitalia is at the forefront of this collection, both subliminally and overtly, where the men's have a number of looks that purposely reveal their genitalia. And there's these strange sweaters, which are actually a reference to a sweater fetish subculture. And the women's also, contrastingly, has a number of looks which look genitalia-esque in a different way as the way that the folds are constructed. It's about depravity out in the open, though in a more playful, less aggressive way. But there is a more serious theme here as well with Sphinx, and that's preserving reason under extreme pressure. The Sphinx is this character who, besides being sort of seductive, also tells these riddles under the threat of killing the person if they don't answer the riddle correctly. And so you have to be very wise and preserve reason under the pressure of the Sphinx. Rick is also basing this concept of preserving reason under pressure, basing the collection off of this French film, set in a submarine where the crew has to preserve reason in this sort of tight corridor of compression. We don't know what this movie is. Rick talked a lot about it in the interviews for it, but he didn't remember the name, and nobody online seems to know which movie this is. But the looks of this season are also based off of French submarine uniforms, in particular these overcoats, which look like they have either rust or blood on them. The whole collection is a metaphor for the intense pressure on the world where the climate change and politics are increasingly becoming more straining, which is further realized in the garments referencing supremacist art movements, which tried to bring order in the wake of the Russian Revolution, but ultimately failed. There's chaos and anarchy in the world, and that is weighing on Rick when he's creating this collection. With the women's, you see Rick trying to sort of retreat into the concept of comfort with certain motifs as well. He stated that while the men's collection, which always comes first, was more about this intense pressure, for women's, he was trying to sort of live more in the retreat from such evil. One of the very clear defined design references for the women's is the Frank Lloyd Wright Hollyhock House. Frank Lloyd Wright House, right in the middle of Los Angeles, particularly right in the middle of the Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard, and it's just sort of an insane area around there. But there's this sort of serene state of retreat and peace once you kind of go into the Hollyhock House. It's like a garden. If you're ever in LA, I'd certainly recommend going there. But for Rick, the Hollyhock House is sort of this place of retreat from peace and the chaos, and for when he was in Los Angeles, from sort of the chaotic nature of Hollywood and Sunset Boulevard. Also notable about the Hollyhock House, it was built in the Mayan revival style, which for Rick is not just a reference, is also sort of exists as a symbol of maternal affection. Again, Rick's mother is Mexican, and sort of diving into that culture represents the safety and the retreat into comfort, into some sort of maternal protection for Rick. The silver and gold masks that are in Sphinx are also references not only to the Mayan masks, but also again to Joseph Boyes, who I've talked about extensively in the other parts of the series. It's one of Rick's biggest influences, but very specifically the direct references to his performance art explaining a picture to a dead hare. It's Rick's favorite artist, and he finds a lot of protection and comfort in that artist. Rick used honey on all of his tags because of that particular Joseph Boyes performance, as well as the hexagram lacing sneakers are also a reference to this. Boyes holding a dead hare in that performance, and the performance also being him standing over a dead pine tree, is sort of coming in the midst of Rick dealing with the climate crisis more and more in his mind. There's an obvious parallel here. There's a lot of themes coming in and out, and a lot of it has to do with, for lack of a better word, doomer or worried he is about climate change. Spring-summer 2016 Cyclopes, we have graduated to another mythical creature, this one being the Cyclopes. Now, the key mythos of the Cyclopes is that in the story of the Odyssey, it's this gigantic, one-eyed creature who's sort of barbaric, warlike. He tries to kill and eat the heroes in this story. But there are also some notable reinterpretations of that, where on one hand, he's actually standing up to the warriors who just brutally destroyed Troy in the Trojan War. Flipping the narrative, both things can sort of exist at once, and similarly, the M65 field jacket, which Rick bases much of the collection around, is the same. Both the Cyclopes and the M65 field jackets are sort of these symbols of brutality in a way. The M65 was the main jacket of the US during the Vietnam War, but at the same time as it became that symbol of fear, it also became the symbol of anti-war protesters. And so Rick is using the M65 and distorting it in a lot of different ways in this collection and changing it to sort of become symbols against war. Rick also intentionally references Stephen Perino and his collages, as well as John Chamberlain's sculptures. Both of these were 1960s US counterculture artists opposing the war. War is at the top of Rick's mind and protesting against it. And so it's very interesting that the name of the collection is this Cyclops. The Cyclops motif is present in the singular eye, which is represented through the circular prints and graphics, which interestingly enough were also a motif by Stephen Perino in his work. And then there are these wispy Joseph Boyes hairstyles similar to Cyclopes'. Rick extends a lot of these themes into the women's wear by sort of reinterpreting the forms of Perino and Chamberlain, but also sort of featured in this collection is the spectacle of women carrying other women, which is a metaphor for the weight that women carry in the world, in the family and pregnancy. The men's and the women's of Cyclopes are pretty varied and different, and it's interesting because Rick isn't looking inward for inspiration as much of what he thinks women should be, but is instead reflecting on something more abstract. And Rick is more focused on bringing in all these different themes and artistic references to make a statement, rather than to create a uniform for his buyer. Autumn-Winter 2016 Mastadon. If you don't know what a mastodon is, it's an extinct variety of elephant, similar to the ones that Rick actually had a giant skull of in his early LA studio. While this might feel like a break from the mythical sort of creature motif that's been going on here, something that's interesting is there's a really clear link to a Cyclops from a Mastadon. Back in ancient Greece, ancient people found early Mastadon skulls from prehistoric times. And they didn't actually know that these were elephant skulls, as elephants weren't native to the area. And so they thought that these creatures, these giant one-eyed creatures, because the area where the trunk comes out almost looks like an eye. And it's thought that these Mastadon skulls that the ancient people found are what actually inspired the Cyclops myth. An elephant not being what it seems is also the primary inspiration for the collection itself, as Rick stated that Swans Reflecting Elephants, a painting by Salvador Dali, which features these swans in a post-apocalyptic landscape, whose reflections create an optical illusion of elephants. Sort of painting is about something beautiful in a dying world. And that's very much the vibe that Rick is trying to create with Mastadon. It's about extinction. It's no mistake that the Mastadon, this creature that the collection is named after, is extinct forever. This collection has some haunting music played over it. The men's has a sample of a voicemail playing over and over again. I just want a phone call before I throw myself into an icy lake. The makeup is this really strange kabuki version of what looks like Gary Newman, and it kind of comes off as almost a parody of humanity. Rick is juxtaposing the extinction and death drive of modern man with prehistoric creatures like the Mastadon. Many of the looks are exaggerated and massively oversized, which is a reference to extinct behemoths like mastodons. The bleaching effect on many of the garments is supposed to reflect either primordial ooze or the tar pits that captured a lot of the prehistoric creatures. If you go to Los Angeles, near where Rick Owens is from, there's something called the La Brea tar pits, which were these tar pits that basically captured these ancient creatures like mastodons actually, got stuck in and were preserved, and you can go look at them if you want to see a mastodon in LA. But this is what this effect is supposed to harken back to. And for the women's, this bleaching effect was actually embroidered in this really brilliant artisan touch. And the women's feature these oversized wisp headwear, again similar to this Joseph and Boyers one, fur basically, reminiscent of a mammoth. Mastadon is this very abstract expression, and it's Rick Owens basically saying, the end is nigh. Throughout the whole press run of this collection, you see Rick talking a lot about his climate fears, and this is actually the peak of it. Mastadon is about human extinction, and Rick was very nervous and upset and somewhat doomer-esque during this press run. This was a very dark and bleak collection where I think Rick truly believed that the end of the world was coming. Walrus, Spring Summer 17. This conversation from Cyclops to Mastadon, now continues into Walrus. Elephants, walruses, common ancestor, and with rising sea levels, walruses evolved into these aquatic creatures. And with the climate change crisis once again threatening to rise sea level, there's an obvious metaphor here, where Rick is saying, maybe with rising sea levels, instead of dying out like mastodons, we're going to evolve like walruses. Rick is slightly less existential here, and more focused on this concept of anthropological adaptation to the situation, about finding a newfound hope, and adapting a lot of the design elements we have seen in his last collection, which were extremely bleak, and instead bringing them into this new hopeful light. Rick is not denying that there is a climate change crisis happening, but he's starting to believe that humanity will adapt and be resilient throughout it. Something changed in between these two collections and created a real semblance of hope for Rick, where he even says in interviews that he believes the climate change crisis is not the end of humanity, but a portal. Not that it wouldn't be without pain or wouldn't be without suffering, but he believed in a way that there would still be beauty on the other side. This has a much more beautiful color palette, and the menswear have these sort of exaggerated togas. Rick's early design influences like Madame Grès, Charles James, and Madeleine Vionnet come to mind and are being used to create sort of this alternative expression of menswear. For Rick, this is a very Deleuzian collection, using folds to create an alternative view on the human body. What is very interesting though, even though I just mentioned a few influences I see in this, Rick usually name drops a ton of artists and inspiration in interviews for his collections. And for this collection, he actually didn't say anything except for one, and that the lines coming out from the hearts in these particular looks were parallel to the Sacred Heart in the Catholic religion. The Sacred Heart in Catholicism symbolizes Jesus Christ's own boundless passion and enduring love for humanity. I wouldn't suggest that Rick Owens is spiritual or religious, but I do think it's poetic that in this collection about regaining hope is about this concept of Christ loving humanity, and he himself is starting to love and have hope for humanity in a similar way. Walrus as a collection represents Rick making an intentional choice, not only in his personal life, but also through his expression, to choose joy and hope. And you see Rick taking that concept and going back to the basics with his pattern making techniques and creating something very, very beautiful. This collection has less layers of meaning than the last few, but it's a more highly technical expression of rebirth and beauty. Rick has stated that he wanted to create something more alien and less ancient and referential, but undeniably beautiful for this collection, because it's his vision and hope for humanity. It's how he sees the best of people persevering through the climate change. This would become sort of the closing chapter for this theme of the ecological threat of climate change. It's Rick coming to peace with it, a theme in Rick's work since Dustulator, but this collection represents the end of this anxiety haunting Rick. While Rick is done with ecological doomerism, for lack of a better word, this era of Rick's work isn't over. And Rick would state with Glitter in Autumn Winter 17 that his clothes are just a continual reaction to threats. His clothes are like armor. And while Rick had some newfound joy in his last collection, we see with Glitter a pretty clear shift in Rick's thinking and philosophy. This is the same era of Rick's work because the change is subject, not form. And the subject of Rick's work is going to shift into oppressive politics, culture, and government, which is not a new theme necessarily. Rick has talked about this before. He's had a lot of collections which reference and go against fascism, but this collection is a shift from it being a micro theme to just basically the major theme of his work. While climate crisis was sort of the major theme stretching for the 10 years prior to this one, this is the end of that, and the new theme is fascism and oppressive governments. This concept didn't come out of nowhere for Rick. Rick wasn't just looking for something new to go against, but it correlates very intentionally with Donald Trump's rise to power in the 2016 election, which presented the world with a new brand of nationalism, conservative rhetoric that really hadn't been seen since before Rick was alive. And the rhetoric of Donald Trump and that form of sort of American politics specifically targeted Rick's own Mexican heritage. And so we're gonna see from now on, starting with Glitter, Rick's work becomes a reactive protest against that. Now, Glitter is an interesting name for this collection because, interestingly enough, there is no glitter anywhere in the collection, but instead the name is a reference to a time in the 70s where opulence, sleaze, and flamboyance were dominant. Now, the actual collection doesn't feel flamboyant. Strangely enough, it feels very post-human and abstract in a way still, as Rick is still really using these avant-garde shapes and constructions. I want to take note that this theme of opulence, sleaze, flamboyance is going to be really fully realized in Autumn/Winter 19 in the next era of Rick's work, but he's starting to play with that now. The actual collection is more reminiscent of some sort of avant-garde kabuki theater. Rick is interested, in his words, about creating a new form of ritual and ceremony. Ceremonies for Rick are about creating a group, agreeing on codes and behaviors, collectively committing to them, and under the most civilized circumstances, community, responsibility, and kindness usually top the list. Crowns and veils are made out of old sweatshirts and t-shirts. That's a reinterpretation of how during World War II, in occupied France, women would wear these ridiculous hats as a sign of protest against their occupation. They are also predominantly in the form of elephants and cats, or Mastadons and Sphinx. From earlier collections, you can't say Rick isn't consistent. A lot of the capes formed in this collection were also meant to harken back to this opera, Samson et Delilah, which is the story of the biblical hero, Samson, who is seduced by his lover Delilah, and she betrays him and seduces him in order to weaken him. It's interesting how specifically the pieces are based off this character, Delilah, who is normally portrayed as the villainess of the story. But it's sort of emblematic to Rick sort of telling a story about how charm can be used effectively against traditional, raw, brute masculine aggression and power, which certainly fit into the rest of the themes of the collection. Specifically, when we think about the women in occupied World War II France. Something also interesting is how proportion is more exaggerated. He shows sort of a deformation here. Long arms and then puffers and puffer scarves create sort of these malignant tumor-like shapes on the models. Now, Rick plays with this malignant sort of bloated theme of a lot in his work from now on, and he has stated sometimes that this represents a physical manifestation of how fascism grows like a malignant tumor in society, or also how these sort of oppressive governments are formed off of like inflated egos. But it's also a very Rei Kawakubo thing to do. Think of her Lumps and Bumps collection. And this was because this idea was also fueled by Michel Lamy, being a massive collector and fan of Comme des Garçons at the time. Now, before this era, Michel Lamy basically mainly wore Rick Owens, but all of a sudden, Michel Lamy began wearing a lot of Comme des Garçons and even said she preferred Rei Kawakubo's designs and wearing them over Rick's design. And Rick became pretty cognizant of that and self-aware. It was a deeply hurtful thing for, after years of Michel championing and wearing Rick's work, that she would stop and instead say, I'm only going to wear Comme des Garçons. Created a real rift in Rick's and Michel's relationship, and Michel stated that Rei Kawakubo's work made her feel better when she wore it than she wore Rick's. This obviously didn't just hurt Rick's ego, but there was also sort of a political fashion implication to this as well, where, it doesn't look great when your wife is stating that she prefers one of your biggest competitors' designs more than yours. But this incident caused Rick to challenge his position of how he designed for women. Until this point, he had been making a lot of styles that were reflective of a younger woman, and Michelle in her 60s and 70s wanted to wear something that rejected that premise of beauty more and more and did something that was maybe more of an avant-garde or artistic expression to wear. And so Rick started making these blob designs for Michelle, and they show up in every single collection of Rick's work since. It was his way of sort of giving into her and her influence and trying to appease her. If you'll remember in the last video, what Rick Owens often does is he'll make one collection that has a sort of point, and then he'll do sort of this dialectical thing where he'll create the next collection, which will be the counterpoint. And that's very much what's happening with Dirt in Spring Summer 18. Dirt is the counterpoint to Glitter. Glitter basically said, if fascism or nationalism or oppressive governments are here, we're going to be flamboyant and sleazy and mock it in its face with our sleaze and abundance and grandeur. But Dirt has a different reaction. Instead, Dirt proposes, what if in a reaction to the ugliness of fascism and nationalism, we instead become more civilized and grounded than it. Instead of provocation, Rick Owens wants to offer an alternative to meet a growingly nationalist movements across the world, but mainly in the US, to show something that's more rational, civilized, ordered. While this collection is supposed to be the opposite of Glitter, interestingly enough, it does have glitter looks. And while Glitter didn't have those glitter looks, Dirt doesn't have any dust brown or dirt colored looks in it either. So Rick uses suit jackets to represent order, elegance, civility, and women's also leans into more gowns and evening dresses. Dirt as a concept, though, is also a reference to land art, specifically that of Michael Eisner, Andy Goldworth, James Turrell. Rick is reinterpreting their design work, and that's where the name Dirt comes from. Land art for Rick is about the human need to try to find order in the wilderness. And the political state and sphere is wilderness, and Rick is trying to find order, much like land art artists. The women's also has a lot of futurist design as inspiration. The particular avant-garde looks that are somewhat chaotic and very Kakubo-esque are apparently Rick trying to interpret French confection or baking pastries from a brutalist lens. Interestingly enough, Dirt 2 would be the first collection which Rick would have at the Palais de Tokyo, which would be the residence of many Rick Owens collections for the years since. Rick stated that he felt like the building was an Art Deco or classic Hollywood representation of what Wagner Valhalla would feel like. And this is intentional because Valhalla is heaven in Nordic mythology. It represents not only Rick's newfound optimism that sort of came in Walrus. Valhalla is where the most civilized, real, true heroes would go, and Rick is trying to make a statement there. The name Sisyphus comes from the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, who is the wicked king who is punished by Zeus for his evil ways. And because of that, for eternity in hell or Hades, he has to push a boulder up a hill only for it to fall down right once it reaches the top. It becomes this endless cycle. Sisyphus is the figure that Autumn Winter 2018 is named after. Now, this collection being named after a wicked king is no mistake for Rick Owens, who has consistently for the past 3 collections been making a commentary on American politics. But Sisyphus also represents a deeper frustration that Rick has with cycles. That is how American politics has regressed from being more progressive to now into this cycle of being more conservative and oppressive. And Rick is sort of lamenting the futility of progress, and he sort of feels like Sisyphus. Lament is a big theme with this collection, and for men's there's a lot of deconstruction techniques and intentional distressing. In ancient Mesopotamian societies, when someone was lamenting or frustrated, they would tear their clothes as an expression of their lamentation, or their grieving. And Rick is doing the same thing here with his menswear. Interesting interpretations of these kimono suit hybrids and this kabuki-inspired makeup which is being done. Both of these are themes that Rick has done before, and for women, he is again playing with cycles of regression and frustration, and the target of Rick's frustration is with the concept of seduction. For Rick, clothes communicates seduction, but in a sort of futile way. He's frustrated with how we keep coming to seduction through our clothes, and he wants to rebel against traditionally seductive clothing. So Rick was inspired by arte povera, which was an art movement that used twigs and other sort of things that were considered worthless to create structures and sculptures. And Rick specifically uses camel hair and linen felt, these unluxurious, kind of almost humble, but like kind of dumpy materials to parallel that. The sculpture-like looks that Rick has the women wear, they have these tumorous lumps which distort the figure, again, very similar to the lumps and bumps of Comme des Garçons. And there are very few elegant dresses and gowns that Rick has sort of been known for. Instead, it's these lumpy, avant-garde sculptures and overcoats which he adorns women in. He's leaning into deformity and masculine expression as a way to try to cope with futile attempts at seduction. Babel is Rick Owens' Spring-Summer 2019 collection. And Rick Owens is going to lean more into mythological stories of men who do evil being punished by God or gods, going from the Greek mythological story Sisyphus to the biblical Judeo-Christian story of the Tower of Babel. Babel is a biblical story of men who try to build a tower to be greater than God, to build their own structure up into the heavens. And then God sees this and he punishes them by sending them into chaos. And at that time, everyone spoke the same language who was building that tower, and they're set into having different languages, and it all sounds like Babel to them. It's an interesting story that's supposed to be an origin of language story, but Rick is living in the creation of an oppressive organization and structure and the chaos that's resulting in it. And again, of course, this is commentary for politics. And so Rick Owens is leaning into towers, architectural diagrams for the majority of this collection as design inspiration. The wiry structure of Tatlin's tower is the most referenced motif through the line designs on the garments or the headpiece in the women's. Rick takes his lump and bump motif of the body and instead creates architectural pieces that are propped out of people, like the poles of a tent. And so you get these geometrical tumors that are coming out of people. The neck hole shirts from last season are directly references but reinterpreted through these pole geometric shirts instead. Tatlin's tower is interestingly relevant as it's a direct parallel to the Tower of Babel, as both towers were never finished. There are these very beautiful, what Rick calls brutalist sequence that are structured in this geometrical way as well. And then of course, America, the USA, is at the top of Rick's mind with this collection, as dirty US flags are made into clothes, as well as these looks which seem to mimic Statue of Liberty. This also seems to be a direct reference as well to the opera costume in the production of Richard Strauss's Salome. There's a reoccurring motif. We're gonna see recreations and reinterpretations of the Salome costume in a lot of seasons to come. And many of these looks are sort of parodies of the way Americans dress. Blue jeans, big fanny packs, swimsuit tops, short shorts. And Rick Owens created his own version of Tatlin's Tower, or the Tower of Babel, and he lit it on fire, with models bearing torches as a symbol of how evil men will not go unpunished. Rick Owens stated that this tower burning is the stairway to heaven being burnt down. The burning of this tower also symbolizes the end of this Rick Owens era. I think it's somewhat poetic that Rick would end this period of his life and his career with something as dramatic as a burning structure to heaven. And what we'll see is this set of ideals that Rick has laid out in this era, this massive abstraction of the body as a protest to not only climate change, but nationalism, is going to be completely flipped on its head. While this might be the most dark era of Rick's work, the next era will probably be his brightest, and it's going to completely shatter the expectations of fans and critics. So join us for that next time when the next episode comes out, part 4. And thank you guys for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more, if you want to support me through making this series, go ahead, click the subscribe button, give this a like, give it a comment. It all means a lot. And if you want to check out my own brand and my own work, check out the link in my description, karstencraning.com. That's the name of my brand. Definitely go check that out as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, guys, and have a great day.